war in Ukraine is a real drama. Not only for the Ukrainians, who are, of course, the victims of a criminal invasion, but also for Russia itself, no matter how much Putin's regime tries to make people believe otherwise. On top of the economic losses, which we have already discussed here not too long ago on VisualPolitik, and also in our exclusive Patreon bulletin, we must add the military losses, which are even more significant. At the time of making this video, Russia has had, according to Western estimates, almost 200,000 casualties since the war began. That is, the total soldiers killed, or unable to fight because they have been wounded or are being held as prisoners. To give you an idea, that would be 8 times more casualties in a single year of war than all the casualties the United States had in its 2 decades in Afghanistan. 8 times as many! In addition, many of the soldiers that do survive will have lifelong physical and psychological damage. However, this does not seem to be a reason for the Kremlin to rethink the war. And do you know what? The truth is that we shouldn't be too surprised. Historically, the Russian military tradition has not exactly been renowned for valuing and protecting the lives of its soldiers, either due to a lack of sensitivity or because of a lack of means. Wars have typically been a meat grinder for Moscow. An example is the Second World War, in which more than 8 million Soviet soldiers died, of whom more than 6.5 million were Russians. And yes, it's true, Putin's Russia is not the Soviet Union, but the war in Ukraine has shown us that, in practice, this mentality has not changed much. Russia is still willing to pay a very high human price in order to pursue its military objectives. All of this is facilitated by the lack of a functional political opposition and an apathetic citizenry, subjected to the regime's intense propaganda campaigns for years. So it is unlikely that the loss of life will be a major impediment to Putin. In fact, many analysts believe that he could still withstand several 100,000 more casualties in Ukraine without really compromising the regime. And naturally, this begs the question, if this is so, in what way could Russia be stopped on the political and military battlefield? What are its weak points if casualties do not seem to be taking much of a toll on Putin? Well, the key is precisely in its armament, in things like tanks, artillery, or aviation. It's one thing to have a lot of men ready to send to the front, but if they're not well equipped, the result can be disastrous, especially if they are facing relatively modern weapons. And no, we're not talking about suddenly starting bombing, or rather blowing up Russian weapons factories left and right, not at all. In this video, we will tell you exactly how Russian military capability is being reduced. We will tell you how sanctions are affecting the military industry. So without much further ado, let's get started.
Disarming the giant.
It's no secret, Russian military hardware losses in Ukraine are proving devastating for what was believed to be the second most powerful military force on the planet. While Ukraine is being supplied by a lot of countries with both arms and ammunition, Russia is so far practically alone in this war. And I'm going to give you some data to give you an idea of what we are talking about. By mid-December, according to the UK Defence Secretary, Russia had lost 4,500 armoured vehicles, of which 1,800 were tanks. In addition, 63 aircraft, 70 helicopters, 150 drones, 12 warships, and more than 600 artillery systems were no longer operational. It has also been firing up to 20,000 artillery rounds per day, and the launching of precision missiles has been far beyond its production capacity. An issue that, by the way, has also affected Ukraine's allies to some extent.
Ukraine is burning through ammunition faster than the US and NATO can produce it.
The difference is that not only can the US and other NATO factories provide weapons or ammunition to Ukraine, but supplies are also being purchased in other countries and then shipped to the Ukrainian military. Clearly, the Western checkbook is very thick, and their industrial capacity can be increased in a relatively short time. However, the Russians do not have that capability today, and certainly no one serious expects them to have it in the near future. In fact, its capacity to manufacture military equipment has been greatly eroded in recent months, thanks in part to international sanctions, and this, my friends, is an element that could prove to be key. Many Western military officials and analysts believe that if Russia fails to keep its military industry up and running, the war could end for lack of weapons, with the resulting embarrassment for Putin potentially spelling his own end. But is this strategy realistic? And does Russia stand to win or lose in the face of a war of attrition? The Kremlin seems to think the former, but is this really the case? Well, you see, there are at least 2 major reasons to think that Russia is going to have an extremely difficult time supplying its military campaign with weapons in the coming months, much more so than it has had so far. The first restrictions on exports to Russia. As we have told you in past videos here on VisualPolitik, both the Russian civilian and military industries are inefficient and, in general, technologically outdated and dependent on other countries. For this reason, the ban on exporting key elements for Russian industry has been one of the main spearheads of the Western strategy. We are talking not only about purely military technologies, but above all, about so-called dual-use equipment. That is to say, cutting-edge technology that is not purely military, but could be used for that purpose, such as advanced semiconductors, optics, and sensors, or even software. These types of sanctions are causing production losses due to a lack of supplies, which not only results in a lower production capacity of combat unit, it also means that the units that do leave the factory, whether new or reconditioned, do so with much more basic technology. Want some examples? Take a look.
Russia's tank plan. Take a 60-year-old T-62, install new optics, send it to Ukraine to get blown up. As it pulls many of its 800 T-62s from long-term storage, Russian tank maker Uralvagonzavod is fitting some of them with the 1PN96MT02 analog thermal gunner's sight that's a generation newer than the T-62's previous gunner's sight.
So, in summary, you take tanks from the beginning of the 60s, get them a slightly newer sight and a couple of other things, and then makeover completed. There you go. Off to Ukraine. It's a 3-year plan, but the ones they have ready will go to Ukraine in desperation. But that's not all. The most modern tanks, such as the T-80 or the T-14 Armata, which supposedly are the crown jewel of the Russian army, are also being fitted with these same optics that are much less advanced than the ones they originally had. And do you know where most of these advanced thermal and optical sights that were proudly equipped on Russian tanks had come from? Well, yes, they did not originate in Russia, far from it, but they came from Western countries, or from its orbit, such as Japan, in the case of some optics, or France, among many others. In fact, according to classified documents obtained by the French investigative journalism organization Disclose, the companies Thales and Safran are said to have supplied the Russian army with highly advanced Western military technologies. These include modern optics for more than 1,000 tanks, as well as TACAN navigation systems for 60 Sukhoi 30s, and infrared detectors for fighter planes. They also reportedly supplied sighting systems for Camel 52 helicopters. Some of these technologies would have been delivered by French companies to Russia until 2020. That is, until well after the 2014 invasion of Crimea and Donbass. These are just a few examples, but the reality is that the Russian military industry is very dependent on Western components of all kinds, as soon as they want to manufacture anything with a certain technological complexity. For example, according to the British defence and security think tank RUSI, R-U-S-I, the fibre optic gyroscopes equipping the 300mm guided missiles used in the Tornado S launchers were US made. There is also the case of the military vehicles of the manufacturer Kamaz, which has had to stop production of all its modern military platforms because the fuel injectors came from the German brand Bosch. Even the Russian Tor M2 air defense system, one of the most powerful short-range air defense systems, has British components that control the platform's radar. That is to say, basically, when it comes to somewhat sophisticated weapons, which could in some way compete with Western weaponry, practically none of them are 100% Russian. Practically all of them have some key component or technology from countries that, right now, no longer provide it. And as you can imagine, this forces Russia to either not be able to manufacture these units or to look for substitutes for these components. Substitutes that are much more outdated, which greatly reduces their original combat capability. And of course, that ultimately weakens Putin's military as a whole. Overall, international sanctions against Russia directly involving more than 30 countries are estimated to have plummeted their imports by more than 40% in 2022. And that's taking into account only those sanctions imposed after 24th of February 2022. Because on top of them, there are also those imposed after the invasion of Crimea and the Donbass. Sanctions that were mainly targeted at the purchase of military equipment and supplies. But in practice, those sanctions made it not possible for Russia to produce or modernize as much weaponry as expected for its armed forces to be upgraded on time. Perhaps Putin thought that occupying Ukrainian territory would not have any consequences. Anyway, who knows? For example, Russia had an agreement to purchase 2 Mistral amphibious assault ships with France that was cancelled following the invasion of Ukraine. But apart from NATO members, other non-sanctioning countries have also recently voluntarily reduced their trade with Russia in order not to have negative consequences on their Western markets, which are obviously far more important than the Russian one. And it doesn't end there. Not at all. There is at least one other reason to think that Russia is going to have a very hard time producing weapons at the rate at which it is using them in the war, and it is purely and simply the economic factor. Think about it. Keeping the military capability afloat in a war that has been going on for more than a year now, and in which they are practically alone, with no support from anyone else, is something that costs a lot, and I really mean a lot, of money. Not surprisingly, sanctions have not been good for the Russian economy. Obviously, war is not cheap. And let's not forget that Russia, as vast as it is, only has a GDP per capita similar to that of countries like Argentina or Romania. The thing is that although official data on the true cost to Russia of the invasion is classified, it is estimated that the military budget was well over 5% of GDP in 2022, even reaching a record not seen since Soviet times. We could easily be talking about $95 billion. This would equate to a deviation from the projected 2022 budget of more than 40%. And it appears that the war has not been as short as expected, and therefore not as cheap either. Now, where do sanctions come into play in this story? Well, basically, economic sanctions such as the end of gas imports or the price cap on Russian oil, among others, are starting to have a considerable impact on Russia's public accounts. For example, according to data, and keep in mind this is sourced from the Russian government itself, the federal deficit in the first 2 months of 2023 amounted to 2.6 trillion rubles, which is about $34.1 billion US dollars. This figure accounts for 88% of the entire deficit forecast by the Russian government for 2023. And so, according to the estimates from Kyiv School of Economics and several analysts, the actual deficit in 2023 will be 3 to 4 times higher than it was in 2022. At the current rate, the government will completely consume the Russian National Investment Fund, NWF, before the end of the year. This is the fund that was supposed to ensure the government's economic capacity in the face of extraordinary situations, like a war in Ukraine. We're talking about a nest egg of $150 billion at the beginning of 2023 that could be consumed in just a few months. From that point on, Moscow's problems could multiply, because the country would basically have only 2 options for sustaining the war effort. A, either finance the war with public debt issuance in the local financial market, which will increase both interest rates and the government's own deficit, or B, monetize debt with central bank issuances, which could trigger inflation. And the fact is, VisualPolitik viewers, Russian government revenues from oil and gas sales during the start of 2023 were down 46% compared to the same period in 2022. And that is not all. The rest of its revenues, not linked to hydrocarbons, are also plummeting. Things are not going so well. This situation is forcing the Kremlin to include the purchase of military equipment within the budgets of the regions. In other words, local and regional governments have not only lost power, but also resources, as part of their budget is now spent on defense. To give you an idea, Russian state expenditures were 58% higher in January 2023 than in the same month of 2022. That's according to official data. Obviously, the more financial strain the Russian state has to undertake in order to finance the war, the more difficulties it will have in doing so. Therefore, economic sanctions, besides the effects they may have on other fields such as public opinion and so on, also have an impact on military capability. However, we would not be telling you the whole story if we overlooked how the Russian defense industry and the state itself have been adapting to all these circumstances. The fact is that, obviously, when sanctions are imposed on you, you try to get around them. And of course, the case of Russia is no different. But to what extent are they succeeding? Well, let's take a look.
Innovate to kill.
Well, we're not going to lie to you. The Russians are demonstrating some ability to bypass some of the international sanctions imposed in order to continue their criminal campaign in Ukraine. However, I can already tell you that these are not effective measures, but just a means to gain time. You see, Moscow is acquiring semiconductors and microchips, as well as other high-tech components, in theory, for civilian use, through countries that do not have to adhere to the sanctions, or have less harsh sanctions, such as China, Kazakhstan, and Turkey. However, through this import channel, it is managing to import far fewer technological products than before, even though some of them have Western components to which they no longer have direct access. In any case, we can't really say that sanctions are not working, because it is evident from everything we have told you that the Russian industrial fabric is far from its peak. Are they producing? Yes, the Russian military industry produces, but much less advanced equipment than before the invasion. In fact, some of the evidence to suggest that Russia is still getting components to manufacture some advanced weapons has been obtained in Ukraine itself. For example, analysis of the remains of some Russian Kh-101 precision-guided missiles launched against Kyiv recently have revealed that they were manufactured between September and October 2022. In other words, Russia is able to continue to manufacture advanced weaponry, although not in the quantity or quality needed to cope with all the Western weaponry that is arriving in Ukraine, including, for the first time, relatively modern tanks such as the Leopard. To give you an idea of the decrepit state of its weapons stockpiles, Russia has already begun firing Soviet-era missiles. And this is known because Russian weapons, particularly missiles, launched against Ukraine, are analysed as closely as possible. For example, in January 2023, a missile launched against the city of Dnipro was analysed and turned out to be a Kh-22, whose production began around 1962, and which are terribly inaccurate. In fact, it ended up hitting a residential building, killing dozens of people.
The residential building in Dnipro was hit by a Kh-22 missile, which cannot be shot down by the Ukrainian air defense.
In short, dinosaur technology. But there is still more. Another example of how Russia is trying to evade sanctions affecting its military capabilities is the import of the famous Iranian drones that have been so much talked about. This has not been the only case, however. They have also imported tanks and armored vehicles from Belarus, and, it is believed, artillery ammunition from North Korea. In short, they are asking for help from the creme de la creme. But at this point, what can we learn from the experience of more than a year of war and all the sanctions applied against Russia? Well, the lesson is mainly this one. Sanctions cannot be the only way to wear Moscow down, because their effect will come mostly in the medium and long term. So they would be of no use without constant military support to Ukraine in the form of arms deliveries. If the Ukrainians do not have the strength to multiply the costs to Russia on the front, not only in lives, but particularly in weapons, then Moscow would probably not have so many problems in extending its military campaign. And yes, obviously this would also further wear down Ukraine, which in 2022 recorded military spending of approximately 32.5% of its GDP, according to the Ukrainian government itself. What's more, yes, it would also wear the rest of us out, because it would lengthen the war. However, at this point, the crucial questions are over to you. After all we have seen, do you think the sanctions on Russia are having an effect in the military arena? Should we increase arms deliveries to Ukraine, even further to accelerate Russian attrition? As always, leave us your opinion below in the comments, and if you like the video, don't forget to like it and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any news. And remember, you can support us through our Patreon page to keep growing and improving. We'll leave you the link below in the description. Once again, thank you so very much for being there. All the best, and I'll see you next time.